So to make a cocktail bun using sourdough starter, we're going to start with a very active starter. So as you can see here, there we go, a very active starter. Okay. And then to that active starter, you're going to add water. As well as sugar. So what we're going to do first is we want this yeast that's in this starter to get very, very activated. And so that's why we're adding the sugar here. To the mixture. And the reason for that is that the yeast, they're going to go into a hyperactivity mode with all this sugar. And that's exactly what we want. Because unlike sourdough bread, where you want to develop the flavors and make it very sour, with this bread, we want it more like a pastry bread. So what I'm doing here is I'm just going to mix the sugar, the water, and the sourdough starter. So it's really well combined. And you might notice that this is similar to what you would do with just regular yeast, right? When you use yeast in a recipe, a lot of times they get you to proof the yeast first by adding some sugar and water and mixing it together. So this is me copying that, but instead using a sourdough starter. And once that's nice and mixed, you can add the rest of your ingredients. So we've got our egg. And then we also have some butter. So I'm gonna just quickly melt this butter. So we'll mix that in there. So this type of dough, you can actually use it for a lot of different things. And it's very similar to the type of dough you would use, say, for a cinnamon roll or any other type of pastry type breads. So you don't need to just use them for cocktail buns. You can do just about anything with it. Okay, so we have all of our liquid ingredients here. And I did say pinch of salt here if you're using unsalted butter, but I actually use salted butter, so I'm not going to add any more salt. And then we're going to add our flour. So for adding the flour, because you don't want the dough to get overly dry and sometimes the eggs are slightly different sizes, add most of the flour, but not quite all of it. So I would start with adding around 250 grams of the flour. You can mix that together. And so I'm just going to move this scale out of the way. And you're just looking to combine the ingredients. And for those of you who like using your hands to mix dough, don't worry, that part's coming next. We're just going to first make this into a rough dough. So you can see it's still quite wet, which is completely fine because we haven't added all our flour yet. And then you can just add small amounts of flour in there. And this is where you can get your hands in. Until you get a dough that's still a little bit sticking to your hands, but not too much. So you can see it's still quite wet. So you can just keep adding small amounts of flour to it. And then also start to knead it. And so you can just knead the flour in as you go, but just don't put too much flour all at once because you don't want the dough to be too dry. So as you can see here now, this dough is becoming quite smooth and it's getting elastic. So that's a good sign. And once you've got it fairly smooth and you can kind of see it's still sticking to my hand a little bit, but not as much. It's quite uniform and stretchy. So you see this nice stretchiness. Then you're good to go. So with this type of a dough, what works best is actually to knead it for a little bit and then leave it for about 10 minutes and let it rest, let the gluten really develop, and then knead it again. So I'm not going to do the second kneading, but that's something that you should do when you're at home. So I'm going to just put this aside and just cover it with a damp cloth. And then we're going to move on to making the filling. And I already measured out my butter, and this is actually a half amount that I'm making because I already made some earlier, so don't mind me. So I've already measured out my butter. Now I'm going to add my sugar. And again, you'll notice that my scale is going to say half the amount of everything. But if you want to make, say, 10 to 12 buns, then that's the amount that you want right there. Okay, so first we're going to cream the butter and sugar together. Okay, and then we add the flour. Again, cream it together. So far, this is a typical filling for a cocktail bun that you, say, would find in a Chinese bakery. The next part is where it's a little bit different. So the cocktail buns that you find in a bakery, they're usually filled with coconut. And in this case, we're going to go back to what I imagined was the original buns when they first made them, where they were filled with breadcrumbs. So we're going to put breadcrumbs in. And it does seem a little bit strange to be just putting breadcrumbs into bread, but it actually turns out to taste pretty good. And then this gets mixed together. Okay, and there we have it. our filling. Doesn't quite look like regular filling because the breadcrumbs are, at least from the sourdough bread that was whole wheat, are a little bit brown versus the yellowy white that you would find in a regular cocktail bun. Let me see the bacon. Okay, so now we get to do the fun part, which is wrapping. So the dough that you would have made and rolled and let rise for around 2 to 3 hours. And so this is where it does change a little bit depending on how active your starter is. So that's why there's such a big time difference between when the dough is risen. But as you can see in this here, it gets to about 1.5 to 2 times in volume compared to the original dough, and it starts to get kind of puffy and bubbly. So I'm just going to take this dough out. So this here is a smaller portion of dough than the recipe. The recipe makes around double this. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to first start by gently pushing out the bubbles. And then we're going to roll this into a log. And cut it into even pieces. Or as even as you can. And then with each of these pieces, we're going to make them into a ball. Then we are going to roll each ball into a circle. And in the middle of each circle, we're going to take a big heaping tablespoon or so of filling. And you're going to spread this filling out so that it forms a line like that. And then you're going to roll this up kind of like a sausage roll. You just roll it like this. And then pinch the ends here together to make a very, very good seal so that your filling does not come out. And you're going to take the whole thing and just lightly roll it. And it's okay if it kind of gets a bit longer because you can always just tuck the pieces back in like so. And so you want to make sure that the seam is on the bottom. And now this is ready to go onto a pan. So I like to just use something like this, a silicone pan. And you can put this on the pan, like so, and cover it up with a damp cloth to let it proof. And so you let it proof for about 30 to 45 minutes. And then after that point, you'll be able to do the decoration and then do the baking. So I've let that one just sit there. And then on this side, you can see, this is one that I've just made a little bit earlier. And so it is ready for decorating. So to decorate, we're going to make the decoration paste. Now the decoration paste is kind of like a cookie topping. So that's the proportions for that. So I've already measured out the butter. So we just have to add a little bit of flour. And again, this one is also about a half proportion. So don't mind the numbers, they're not going to exactly match. And don't worry about going all the way down to the gram. So we're just going to mix this together. And what this decoration paste does is it forms these lines on the finished product, which I will show you in just a second. Now what's interesting about this decoration paste is I learned that in Cantonese it's actually called white oil because the strips that it makes is kind of white on the top, and that's a bit of a contrast to the golden yellow bun that you get. Almost looks like an icing, like pretty much a buttercream, but you bake it instead. Okay, so once this paste is made, then you can either put it into a small plastic bag with a corner that's snipped out, or a pastry bag, which you can, if you already have a pastry bag like this one, then you can just put it directly in there. Or you can make a pastry bag out of parchment paper. So there's lots of different options. So whatever you do, just get it into some form of a bag so you can squeeze it out. So you just want to squeeze this. Push the air out. Okay. So before putting this decoration paste on, we're going to put an egg wash on the dough. So this is just a beaten egg. You're just going to spread this egg onto the bun. And then this decoration paste, you can use whatever pattern you like. So the classic one is usually just one line like this and another line like this. And normally what they do is when you have lots of these buns, you have them all side by side and you just do one big long line across of them. But I just had one for demonstration. So that's what it looks like. So this would then go into an oven at 375 degrees Fahrenheit for around 15 minutes to bake. And that's about it for the buns. So I'll show you what a finished one looks like. So that's an example of the finished product that you will get after this. So that's one way that you can use breadcrumbs in a very, very creative way, or you can just top it on mac and cheese and other recipes that might not take as much effort.